You know, there are moments in history, quiet, unassuming moments, that don't come with fireworks or headlines, but still carry the weight of 1,000 storms. Moments when truth walks into the room and suddenly the noise, the posturing, the bluster, it all falls away. Because deep down, no matter how loud the world gets, people still recognize the power of integrity. They still feel the pull of compassion. And they still know the difference between noise and leadership. Now, I've seen my fair share of bluster in this world. I've watched as fear was sold like a cheap product, repackaged every election season, stamped with a slogan, and passed off as strength. I've watched how the loudest voice in the room tried to drown out reason, how hate disguised itself as patriotism, and how division dressed up as policy. But then something happens, something real, something grounded in truth. And in that moment, the room gets quiet. Not because the shouting stops, but because people stop listening to it. You see, true leadership isn't about who can throw the harshest insult. It's not about turning every disagreement into a spectacle. It's about showing up every single day with a heart full of service. It's about listening when others are screaming, about standing still when the world is rushing to judgment. This is the non-reformed, dishonest, about dishonest, disassociated. It's about listening when others are screaming, about standing still when the world is rushing to judgment. And it's about having the courage to say, I don't have all the answers, but I'm here to build, not to burn. I remember speaking at a town hall, and a young man stood up, voice trembling, and asked, how do I stay hopeful when everything feels broken? I looked him in the eye and said, hope is not blind. Hope is not naive. Hope is the decision to stand firm in the face of cynicism. Hope is what gets you out of bed when the world says, why bother? And in that room, filled with doubt and fatigue, something shifted. Not because I had said something magical, but because truth has a gravity that pulls people back from the brink. It's easy to perform. It's easy to wave your arms and make the crowd roar. What's harder is building something lasting. What's harder is sitting with someone who disagrees with you and finding common ground. What's harder is looking at history not with nostalgia or shame, but with honesty and asking, how do we do better? And when you do that, when you choose decency over theatrics, unity over ego, service over self, you may not get the applause, but you will get the silence of respect. There are moments, rare, fleeting, where the truth lands like a thunderclap. And in those moments, all the noise, all the chaos, all the fire and fury, it fades. Because the truth doesn't need to shout. The truth just stands. And when it does, the silence that follows isn't weakness, it's reverence. We live in a time when volume is often mistaken for value, where the one who shouts the loudest is assumed to be the one with the most conviction. But real leadership is found in the willingness to listen, to learn, and to lead, not with anger, but with purpose. Because when all the shouting stops, people don't remember the decibels, they remember the direction. You don't earn trust by mocking your opponents or spinning every fact into a personal victory. You earn trust by showing up when it's inconvenient, by telling the truth when it's hard, and by serving others when there's no political gain. It's easy to pander, it's easy to blame. What's difficult is to take responsibility when things go wrong. What's difficult is to tell the American people not just what they want to hear, but what they need to hear. Leadership doesn't require a stage or a spotlight. In fact, some of the most important acts of leadership happen away from the cameras. When a teacher stays late to help a struggling student, when a nurse sits beside a frightened patient, When a parent works two jobs just to make sure their children can dream a little bigger than they did. That quiet kind of leadership, the kind rooted in sacrifice and love, is what holds this country together. And if we're being honest, that's the kind of leadership that outlasts the slogans and survives the scandals. Now, there are folks who will try to sell you strength wrapped in fury. They'll tell you that to be strong, you've got to be mean, that compromise is weakness, and that empathy is some outdated relic of the past. But history tells a different story. History shows us that strength isn't about domination. It's about determination. That leadership doesn't look like chaos, it looks like character. And that the people who move the world forward are not always the ones banging on podiums, but the ones who stay steady when the storm hits. I've sat across from people who disagreed with me deeply. People who saw the world through a different lens, came from different places, prayed in different ways. But in those moments, I didn't see enemies. I saw people who saw the same things and wanted to know that they didn't measure up to my standards or my morality or my ideals. That they weren't morally distinctive. That they served a longer country. All Americans. I saw human beings. And my job wasn't to defeat them, it was to understand them, to find common ground, to build bridges where others saw only walls. That takes patience, that takes humility, but more than anything, it takes courage. The truth is, real leadership doesn't need to advertise itself. It speaks in action. It walks in consistency. And when it stands firm in principle, even the loudest critics are left with nothing to say. Not because they've been silenced, but because deep down they recognize something they can't argue with. Hope isn't some passive emotion we stumble into when things are going well. It's not a warm feeling reserved for sunny days or peaceful times. Hope is a deliberate choice. It's a muscle we strengthen when the world seems heavy, when progress feels slow, when voices around us are filled with doubt. It's what pulls us forward when everything around us is telling us to stand still or turn back. Who marched in Selma, not for those who fought for workers' rights, not for immigrants who left everything behind for a better future. They didn't hope because the odds were in their favor. They hoped because they had no other choice but to believe that tomorrow could be better than today. I've met people all across this country and the world. Students in crowded classrooms, single parents working two jobs, young activists organizing on street corners, self-activists reinstituting social schools and education for young single parents working two jobs. Young activists organizing on street corners, students coming from nothing to billions of dollars in profit. They did this because they had to. They did this because they felt they should have to. They wouldn't do otherwise because it was not fair. And every time I ask them how they keep going, how they keep believing, they give me an answer rooted not in fantasy, but in faith. Faith in their community. Faith in their values. Faith in the possibility of change, even when the path is uncertain. That's what hope really is. Messy. It demands more from us than cynicism ever will. Cynicism is easy. It lets us stand on the sidelines, complain without contributing, mock without participating. But hope says, get up, show up, do the work. Hope demands that we not only dream, but act. That we not only believe, but vote. That we not only care, but serve. It's the daily decision to reject bitterness, to silence the voice that says nothing will ever change, and instead ask, what can I do today to move us forward? And yes, hope will test you. There will be moments when you feel like the only one holding on to it, when setbacks come hard and fast, when promises are broken and progress is undone. But that's the very moment when hope becomes most powerful. Not when it's easy, but when it's necessary. When it pushes us to keep going, not because we're guaranteed to win, but because the fight itself matters. We've seen over and over that hope doesn't whisper. It insists. It refuses to let history repeat without resistance. It lights the way in the darkest hours, not with grand gestures, but with quiet determination. That's why I've always believed in it. Not because I'm an idealist, but because I've watched it change lives. I've watched it transform communities. I've watched it turn pain into purpose, anger into action, despair into direction. I've watched it turn pain into purpose. 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 And I believe it can still do that if we're willing to choose it again and again, no matter how hard the road ahead might seem. We live in a world that often rewards ego, where the loudest voice gets the headline and the flashiest gesture gets the spotlight. But decency, that quiet, unwavering commitment to doing the right thing, is what truly shapes lives. Decency isn't about getting credit. It's about giving respect. It's not about proving you're right at all costs. It's about being willing to lose a point to preserve your principles. And when leaders act out of decency, they may not win every argument, but they win something far more lasting: trust. You don't need to demean others to elevate yourself. You don't need to stir up fear to inspire loyalty. Real leadership is found in the humility to say, I see you, I hear you, I may not agree with everything you say, but I will treat you with dignity. And I would never want anybody to feel like that. It's unbearable. And I would never want anybody to say, I see you, I hear you, I may not agree with everything you say, but I will treat you with dignity. And I know this not for my sake, because I've been called names, but for theirs. That approach doesn't get viral applause, it doesn't dominate headlines, but it builds bridges. And those bridges endure long after the cameras are gone. I've seen what happens when people choose ego. It becomes a performance, a mask of strength that crumbles the moment it's challenged. But decency, that's real strength. That's what allows someone to stay grounded when they're being pulled in every direction. It's what allows a person to resist the urge to retaliate, to step above the insult, to reach for empathy instead of outrage. It's not weakness, it's a rare form of courage. We teach our children to treat others with kindness, to share, to listen, to play fair. Yet somehow, as adults, we're told those same values are signs of naivete. I reject that. We need to teach people how to treat others with kindness, to stand up for those who are poor, and to resist the urge to retaliate in some way, shape. We need to teach people how to treat others. We need to teach people how to treat others with kindness, to reveal truth. I fail in this area to this very day. And my worst, I believe that being decent, being kind, being honest, those are the values that should guide us, not just in our homes, but in our politics, our policies, and our leadership. Because if we don't bring those values into the public square, then we're left with something hollow, loud maybe, but empty. There's power in saying, I don't have all the answers, but I'm here to learn. There's strength in admitting when you're wrong, and even more strength in asking how you can make it right. The strength in our country has been in saying, we can't do this, but we can be better. There's strength in admitting when you're wrong, and even more strength in asking how you can make it right. There's strength in admitting when you're wrong, and even more strength in asking how you can make it right. And when leaders embody that spirit, not just in words, but in their decisions, in the way they treat others, in the way they show up, that spirit has a ripple effect. It inspires the people around them to lead with the same grace. I've sat with community organizers who didn't have wealth or fame, but carried an unshakable sense of responsibility to their neighbors. I've seen civil servants work long hours, not for praise, but because they believe in serving something greater than themselves. That's the kind of example that moves the needle. That's the kind of leadership that outlasts the chaos. When we choose decency over ego, we're not just choosing a better tone, we're choosing a better future. One where people are lifted up, not torn down. One where truth still matters and character still counts. There are moments when the most powerful response isn't a rebuttal or a retort or a comeback, it's silence. Not the kind that comes from fear or surrender, but the kind that follows truth, when it's spoken plainly and without apology. Because when something real is said, something that touches the heart, something that cuts through the noise, it doesn't need to be shouted. It doesn't need to be defended. It just stands there, undeniable. And in that space, when the crowd quiets down, and even the loudest voices run out of words, there's a kind of reverence. A moment when people realize they've witnessed something that rises above the usual back and forth. That's when silence speaks louder than all the noise that came before it. I've seen those moments. I've been in rooms where the energy shifted, not because I raised my voice, but because I spoke from a place of conviction. If you've ever been when the cameras were rolling, there's not a moment of reverence that comes along, because they see that not just anyone, but anything can be attacked on, from a time in the court, then a textbook, or in some occupied book. There's a moment of silence. There's a moment of silence. And I've watched the loudest critics go still. Not because they were defeated, but because they recognized in that moment that truth had entered the room and it demanded their respect. That kind of moment doesn't happen often. But when it does, it leaves an impression that no soundbite ever could. I wanted, it made it pretty easy. In politics, there's a temptation to always be talking the same, to always be an asshole to people you disagree with. And the more time you invest in it, the more time you lose it. Leadership knows when to speak and when to let the truth breathe. There's power in restraint. There's wisdom in knowing that not every attack needs a response. Not every jab needs to be returned. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is hold your ground, look someone in the eye, and let your integrity speak for itself. People often mistake volume for vision. They assume that because someone is loud, they must be strong. Because they dominate the headlines, they must be leading. But history tells us otherwise. History tells us that real change has almost always come from those who didn't need to raise their voice to raise consciousness, from those who stood quietly but firmly on the side of justice, from those whose strength came not from their dominance, but from their depth. There are times when you say what needs to be said and the room falls silent, not out of awkwardness or discomfort, but because something true just landed. That kind of silence isn't empty. It's full of recognition, full of reflection, full of the realization that beyond all the bluster and all the bravado, there is still a hunger in people for authenticity, for honesty, for hope. That's the silence that follows real leadership. The silence that follows real leadership. That's the silence that leaves people thinking long after the words are gone. I've learned that when you carry yourself with a sense of purpose, when you ground your words in values that go beyond ego or ambition, you don't have to chase attention. Attention comes. But more importantly, respect comes. And not the kind of respect that's demanded or manufactured, but the kind that's earned, moment by moment, action by action. And you all know, when you are with people who see that this person comes to their country to be and to do, that's the kind of respect that's demanded or manufactured, but the kind of respect that moves and moves without check. That's always intention. That's always been my dream. The kind that even your opponents, deep down, can't deny. Because when truth is spoken with clarity and calm conviction, it does more than make a point. It makes people pause. And in a world that too often rushes to the next headline, that pause matters. It creates space. It gives people a chance to feel again, to think again, to hope again. That's the power of a moment that rises above the noise. These are the ones who push through to get to the other side, to find the greater. That's the power of a moment that rises above the noise. That's the kind of moment that leaves the loudest critic with nothing left to say. Not because they've been silenced, but because in their heart, they've heard something they can't argue with. So in the end, we are reminded that the strength of a nation is not measured by the volume of its arguments, but by the values that guide its actions. We are called to lead, not with anger, but with integrity. To hold on to hope, not because it's easy, but because it's necessary. To choose decency when ego tempts us. And to recognize that when truth stands tall, even the loudest noise will fall into silence. Our greatest power lies not in how forcefully we speak, but in how deeply we live what we say.